I'm Jane Hansen. This week in the arena, the stem cell research debate. It's been a year since President Obama lifted the restrictions that President Bush put into place, banning federal funds from being used for embryonic stem cell research. Is this a step in the right direction for the elimination of deadly diseases? Or is it simply the elimination of human life? Joining us now to debate this is Monsignor Kieran Harrington, the Director of Communications for the Diocese of Brooklyn, Grant Gallicho, the Associate Editor of Commonweal magazine, Jennifer Miller, who is the Executive Director of Bioethics International, and joining us on the telephone is Paul Lauritzen, the Director for the program in Applied Ethics at John Carroll University. Welcome to all of you. So let's just set the baseline here and take a pulse about how you feel about that whole issue.
The Church is yes to adult stem cell research and no to embryonic stem cell research, because embryonic stem cell research involves the willful destruction of human life or research on human life that has been willfully destroyed.
Grant?
I think the Church is right about that. When you're creating human life essentially to farm it for the benefit of other human life, I think you're involved in a scary proposition.
Jennifer, you're a scientist. That's your background. And now you've turned into the field of ethics. So as a scientist, what do you think about embryonic stem cell research?
Well, I think it's critical to explain that the Church is always pro-science, but we're also pro-human life. So we want to make sure that our science is at the service of every human life. And so that's where a lot of the ethical issues come into play.
All right, and Paul, I want to get to you now on the telephone, and obviously you've got some very strong opinions about the embryonic stem cell research. Can you take us through exactly what you feel, how it might even play in with the use of adult stem cells?
Right. Well, I certainly think all of us would agree that it would be preferable not to destroy embryos to derive stem cells, and in that way we would all endorse adult stem cell work. My concern is that the sort of technical skills we have now to work on adult stem cells actually have come, at least in part, through work that scientists have done on embryonic stem cells. And so that raises a problem about sort of touting adult stem cell research as morally unproblematic if, in fact, that research depends on knowledge that we've gained from embryonic stem cell research.
But that knowledge is already there, Paul. So why go back into that moral dilemma now? Do you mean that we shouldn't? I mean, you could compare it to a lot of other things.
Right. Well, I mean, I think, for example, if you look at the instruction that the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith released in 2008, a document called Dignitas Personae, the congregation itself was worried about researchers using stem cells, embryonic stem cells, that they had not themselves derived, but were available because others had destroyed embryos to obtain these stem cells. And they said, you know, you wouldn't want researchers, even those researchers who hadn't destroyed embryonic stem cells, to use stem cells that had come from embryos, because it would involve cooperation with evil and give scandal. So I guess my question, I'm not certain about the answer, I'm just raising it as a question: why is it okay to use knowledge derived from destroying embryos but not the cells?
Well, Paul, just Monsignor Harrington here, just a quick thought on that. I mean, there's a difference between approximate cooperation with evil and remote cooperation with evil.
Right.
And I think that that's really the difficulty here. And you know, what is remote cooperation with evil? In other words, far away from the evil, that you're cooperating with evil, not willfully cooperating with evil, you're far away from it. That's permissible, but proximate cooperation evil, where I am actually cooperating in a willful manner, is not permissive.
Let's just say that some kind of a vaccination is developed, something that will prevent people from getting a disease, and the way in which it was developed might not have been as pure as we would have liked. Is that wrong?
Well, no, I'm certainly not saying that that's wrong, but I am saying I'm not even saying that using this knowledge is wrong. I'm raising a question, which is, I have concerns when opponents of embryonic stem cell research cite adult stem cell research as morally unproblematic, knowing full well that we couldn't be doing the work that we're doing on adult stem cells if we hadn't done the work on embryonic stem cells. And that raises a kind of problem of dirty hands. I'm not willing to get my hands dirty, but given that someone else has done it, I'm perfectly happy to use those individuals as sort of moral mercenaries. We'll let them do the moral dirty work, but we'll take their work and do it and say, well, we don't have dirty hands.
Jennifer, I'm curious about how you would approach that subject, because you come at it from two different viewpoints. As a pure scientist, and also as somebody who is now involved in, switched your attention to the world of ethics, bioethics. So how do you, that must be a real dilemma for you thinking this way.
Well, just first looking at the practical side, what I would hear is an implication that with every scientific next step, we'd have to look at where that science originated, which would, on a very practical level, be so much work for a scientist, stepping into the lab every day, researching every single step that was taken before him to get to where he is today, maybe 100, 200, who knows how many years later that he's working on X, Y, and Z in the lab. So from a practical perspective, to investigate where every single scientific step has originated is a lot of work. And I'm not sure that that's exactly the duty of every scientist in a lab to do. I understand what he's saying, but in practicality, that's very challenging.
Right.
Yeah.
So can you explain, though, that adult stem cells, I don't know that it's very clear to the world that adult stem cells have been used, or at least in the laboratory and in clinical trials, have been used to be very effective in preventing or curing or treating some diseases. Can you describe that for me?
Sure. A stem cell has three main properties that a normal cell wouldn't have. One is that it's undifferentiated, meaning it's not a special type of cell. It can turn into a special type of cell, which is the second property. It can turn into a heart cell, a liver cell, a pancreas cell, etc. So it's not specialized, but it can specialize. The third property is it can continue to divide and multiply over a long period of time, potentially indefinite. So if you start with one cell, it can turn into 2 cells, 4 cells, 8 cells. So those are very appealing properties. So within stem cells, you have 2 main types, an adult stem cell and an embryonic stem cell.
Adult stem cells are obviously what all of us have.
Right, but
Okay.
they're also found in, and this is a little bit of confusion, in the places associated with children, like with cord blood.
Right.
The umbilical cord blood.
Okay, but the point is that they're different. Mm-hmm. The embryonic and the adult stem cells are
Right.
different because the embryonic are
Right.
younger and much more flexible.
They're different because an embryonic stem cell comes from an embryo, which, as Dr. Oz from Oprah said, we all once were, and it requires the destruction of the embryo. And an adult stem cell does not require the taking of a human life.
But isn't it true that adult stem cells are safer in that the DNA, we know that our body isn't going to reject them?
Right. So
Because they come from us or
just
somebody
like
close to us.
Just like an organ, your body is less likely to reject it.
I guess the trouble I'm having with all of this is understanding why we even need to have this huge discussion about embryonic stem cells, if adult stem cells might indeed be able to.
Sure.
I mean, we don't know.
Yeah.
We just don't know yet, right?
Right. So, but originally, this is a new development. Originally, embryonic stem cells were preferred by scientists because they were blank slates, meaning you could potentially turn that blank slate into any type of cell that you wanted: heart, liver, pancreas, etc. Whereas adult stem cells were more limited. You could only turn them into certain types of cells. But then a year ago, we learned how to reprogram an adult stem cell. So take it from a state where it could only turn into some cells into a state where it could turn into almost any stem cell, like an embryonic.
Right.
So
right. Paul, as you're listening to this discussion about the difference between adult and embryonic stem cells, which I really wanted to bring out because I am not as familiar with it as I'd like to be, and I'm sure many people in the audience are probably curious too. Do you then think that maybe we should just be focusing on the adult stem cells and even take this moral issue and set it to the side for the moment?
Well, I certainly think it would be preferable if we could do what Jennifer was suggesting and induce so-called adult stem cells to a stage where they essentially mimic the function of embryonic stem cells. But notice, and I don't want to harp on this point that I was making earlier, but the reason we know how to do so-called induced pluripotent stem cells, these adult stem cells that we coax into embryonic stem cell-like state, is that we've done the embryonic stem cell work. But apart from that, I think, sure, if we can do the adult stem cell work, that's a good thing. I don't think we want to be creating embryos in order just to destroy them for their stem cells.
Okay,
but there's a tension here.
Let's get to the real heart of the matter, though. There are some claims that embryonic stem cells will be the ones that will be important in helping to develop cures for such things as juvenile diabetes, perhaps Parkinson's, etc. If your child, let's just say that you had a child and this child had juvenile diabetes and you knew that embryonic stem cell research might help to save that child's life, what would you do?
Well, I think any parent wants to save a child's life who has a life-threatening illness. And in fact, this is an increasing problem. The American Journal of Bioethics has an article in the work on stem cell tourism. The increasingly common phenomena of folks who are facing devastating illnesses traveling abroad to get what may or may not be actual stem cell therapies. So certainly I can understand the desperation of a parent, and so that's a concern.
How do you feel about that, Grant?
I think we're pretty far from that point in time. I would like to know what Paul thinks about the usefulness of continuing with embryonic stem cells if we really are at a point when the adult pluripotent stem cells are actually behaving in ways that scientists would like to see them behave.
Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that the research both for adult stem cells and embryonic stem cell therapies would go much faster if we continue to do research on embryonic stem cells. Would I prefer if we stopped now and just took the stem cell lines that we currently have? Probably, although, my own view is that early embryo is not a person with rights. I still don't think we ought to be creating such an organism simply as a material object that we manipulate, but I don't think it's a person. So, my own personal view is that deriving stem cells, from early embryos is not ending the life of a person. So, in that, I probably disagree with your other guest.
I think that there is really a politics is driving a lot of this research as well, and money is following money in this, which is really driving a lot of the research. But
absolutely.
But one of the big questions here is that people often make is okay, look, there are a lot of women in the United States who have abortions. As a result of those abortions, there are embryos, those embryos are not being intended. The intention is not to harvest. The intention is a woman is terminating a pregnancy. Why not use those embryos? That's the other argument that's being made regularly in this debate.
Yes, and I certainly wouldn't favor that. I mean, as you know, President Obama's policy is to take frozen embryos left over from in vitro fertilization cycles and to try to derive stem cells from those embryos. And the argument is, well, they're going to be thrown away anyway, so why don't we get the stem cells? And I'm not entirely happy with that argument, but the flip side is, in the same document from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith that I mentioned before, the congregation took up the issue of whether it would be okay to adopt those frozen embryos and give them a chance of a fuller life, outside of cryopreservation tank, and the conclusion seemed to be, well, no, we shouldn't. So I'm just wondering why not? If there are persons and we could give them something of a life. There are lots of issues here.
There are so many issues. It is really complicated. What you just brought up, Monsignor, I mean, you start to think about all of those moral dilemmas involved, and it's really complicated. We're going to take a break for just a moment, and then we'll continue this discussion on stem cell research, so do stay with us. Welcome back. Our topic today is the stem cell research debate and whether or not federal funding should go into this type of research. And obviously, we're talking about research, we're talking about the medical field, we're talking about business, and we're talking about money. So how much of this is fueled by the whole world of business? Paul, you want to address that first?
Well, I mean, it was striking to me. I don't know if you saw this piece in the New York Times yesterday about clinical trial testing an Alzheimer's drug. This was not stem cell research, but what was interesting to me about the article is that it was on the business page, because it was about the ineffectiveness of this treatment, and the stock in this company was down. And I think there's no question that you have for-profit companies investing heavily in both embryonic and adult stem cell research. And I think the question that all of the guests here would want to raise is, who's going to have access to these therapies and at what cost? So I think most of this research is proprietary, and it's designed to yield big profits.
But in the best of all possible worlds, isn't really anything any medical company or any pharmaceutical company or anybody is doing is trying to find cures?
Sure, but it's cures with a price tag, and whether those cures will be available to everyone is, I think, an important question that Catholic tradition would ask.
That question that you just asked is brilliant, but it applies to almost every technology that a pharmaceutical company develops. So the question always is, which technologies are they choosing to develop, right? Something very profitable like Viagra, or something that affects maybe 2% of one small town in Africa that can't afford to pay for the drug. And then the question is, if they do develop a certain technology, how do they price it so that it's affordable and accessible to everyone? So that question is not limited to stem cell research, but to every single technology developed by a pharmaceutical company. And it's up to that company to find the balance point in price where they enable innovation to continue in other areas, but it's also maximizing affordability and access at the same time.
But is that kind of a pipe dream?
Well, that's what I work on every day with these companies, and they are aiming to find that balance, and it's a judgment call, but it's that they aim to find it. It's that the intention is there.
Not every tech involves destroying nascent human life.
Right.
And that's what the issue is. And there's been a ton of money poured into embryo-destructive stem cell research, and there have been technologies that have been designed and patented to assist in that kind of research. And so you have biotech firms that license that tech to another biotech firm. So there's a lot of money in it.
And you see that happening state by state, beginning with California, right, which began funding embryonic stem cell research. You have investors in companies who have made a bet that this research is going to be profitable. Then you have federal dollars following that, which is backing up that bet. So it really is almost like a Ponzi scheme here, that you have a few investors at the top, then you have we who are the taxpayers at the bottom of the pyramid, everyone trying to chase a cure. And it seems, at least, that there, at least as of right now, there hasn't been much of a direction finding a cure.
Does it mean that this is not the answer? I mean, we keep looking to embryonic stem cell research. I mean, that's the way it's been touted, as that may be, despite the moral dilemma, it may be a way to find cures for countless numbers of diseases.
Hope is always going to be the most difficult thing, because you're ultimately in a position, if you're opposing embryonic stem cell research, of being against hope for people, at least how they perceive it. And so it's a very difficult argument to make. And the question really comes down to is, why are you telling me not to pursue this research which can provide a cure for my child's juvenile diabetes, which is a killer, or my mother who has Alzheimer's, or my brother who has Parkinson's. Whatever you get into these situations, the person who's opposing embryonic stem cell research is really in the unenviable position of opposing hope. And that's what seems...
So what do you say?
Well, I know what you can say is that nobody's saying that we don't want to find these cures. It's that we need to look at the means that we take to find the cure. And adult stem cells at this point have been seen from a scientific perspective as more promising than embryonic stem cells. So Ian Wilmot, the scientist who cloned Dolly, the sheep, now has come out and said that, in essence, the stem cell debate is dead, and we should throw our money and our time behind adult stem cells. So
he said essentially that the embryonic stem cell debate is dead?
Well, Dr. Oz on Oprah said that the embryonic stem cell debate is dead, but Ian Wilmot now is leaning towards the use of adult stem cells.
But was his thinking that it's because the adult stem cells are better as stem cells, or because he thought that the ethical question wasn't worth tweaking?
I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I believe it was from a scientific perspective.
And what do you say to that, Paul?
Well, just a couple points. One is, I think this point about opposing embryonic stem cells as being opposed to hope is a really important one. And unfortunately, a lot of advocates of embryonic stem cell research have used really unfortunate rhetoric. That you will have blood, that opponents will have blood on their hands, which I think is just frankly nonsense. And the reality is that if we allocate money to any area of research, we're by definition allocating money away from some other. Mm-hmm. And so it's a debate about where it should be allocated, not about whether we shouldn't be working towards cures of one sort or another. So even though I support even embryonic stem cell research, I completely agree that we shouldn't be castigating opponents as if they're somehow opposed to cures for juvenile diabetes or something.
It's like an onion. You just start to peel away these layers and it becomes more and more and more complicated. Thank you so much, Paul, for being with us today. Jennifer, last word from you?
I just want to say again, the church has never been against science. We have always been at the service of life, which science is one of the great tools that we have to promote life. And so we need to find ways to carry science forward in the most beneficial way for every member of the human society.
Thank you, Jennifer, for being with us. We are going to be right back, and we'll be joined by our regular contributor, Elizabeth Scalia, and we'll have some final thoughts about stem cell research. So do stay with us. Welcome back. Continuing our conversation on the stem cell research debate, we're now joined by the show's other regular contributor, Elizabeth Scalia, contributor to First Things and author of the blog, The Anchoress. I could tell you were chomping at the bit as you were listening to some of this. First of all, your whole point is the last time you wrote about stem cell research, the adult stem cell therapies that were being used were...
In 2008, the last time I was really doing any heavy research into this, there were 72 successful applications using successful therapeutic applications using adult stem cells. And so there were 0 for embryonic. In fact, there were some real horror stories connected to embryonic stem cell research.
But the question is, if it wasn't being funded at that point, or the funding had been lessened, I mean,
that's a perception, but I don't know how accurate it is. First of all, there was never any prohibition on private capital funding for embryonic stem cell, but the funding was not there, and I think it's because it wasn't panning out. People aren't going to invest in research that's not panning out. In terms of federal money, there was some federal money that had been pledged to existing embryonic lines.
Now, I know, Grant, this is a subject that you feel fairly passionate about. What is it about this whole debate that has got you, as we listen to what's already gone on here debate, that really has you saying, here's what I feel and here's what I think?
I think Americans are viewing, I'm worried that Americans are viewing embryonic stem cells as magical. And I think a lot of the proponents of embryo-destructive research are selling it, as Paul mentioned in the previous segment, as this cure-all. And if you're opposed to this kind of research, you have blood on your hands. It's not just another product. You're talking about creating human life to destroy it. And that really frightens me. I'm not a huge fan of slippery slope arguments. I think that is the best slippery slope argument. I mean, it's very scary.
This is the question. I mean, is any means acceptable in the hope of a cure? Can we do anything to hope?
No, you can't. Okay, here, let me give you an example, all right? How you can't be an enemy of hope. If you were to tell me you have a daughter who has cancer, all right, and I were to tell you I may be able to cure your daughter's cancer by slitting Grant's throat, okay? Would you say, go ahead and slit Grant's throat because my daughter should live?
Of course I wouldn't.
Of course you wouldn't, but you do it for an embryo because you say, oh, I can't really see it. It's not real to me. It's something that's kind of in the netherworld. But the fact that it's in the netherworld is something that should really concern us because it's created very close to God. And the embryo is part of tomorrow, which Khalil Gibran tells us we can't go to.
Paul raised, I thought, a very good point, and I think and this is, again, the argument that's being made. Look, these embryos are in cryonic states. A lot of them are not going to be, what is going to happen to them anyway? I mean, if we say this is nascent human life, it is human life, human person, what happens with, so the argument is, and of course, I oppose embryonic stem cell research. I find it to be abhorrent. However, the argument that's being made is that this human life is not, it's
never going to be.
It's never going to be. And so why not then use it to help my daughter with her juvenile diabetes, or my son who has Parkinson's?
Because we've forgotten our origins, and the more we say, let's just use this for me, and I'm a finite being, but let's just use this for me, we're distancing ourselves from eternity. And I think the embryo is a connection to eternity.
But these embryos are in freezers.
Yeah, they're in freezers, and the church is going to have to work out what can be done about that. I know President Bush had a program, I think it was called the Snowflake Adoption Program.
Yeah, that was Rick Santorum was a very big proponent of snowflake babies.
So I think Bruce Willis got involved in it too, where they would adopt frozen embryos, but then the church had some issues with that, some moral issues, and they're not really figured out yet. And the reason we have moral issues is because, well, we don't really favor unnatural conception to begin with. Right. What does this do to our stand on in vitro fertilization?
And doesn't this raises the important question is that bioethics, advances in technology are posing enormous challenges for the church and for Christians.
And for everyone.
For all of us, because we can't, how do we come to some resolution on these matters? How do we understand?
But we're going to have to come to a resolution about this show. Last word from you?
I think that we cannot be in a position of shutting off hope for people. And at the same time, I think that where there seems to be great advances is on adult stem cell, and I think that that's really where our resources should be devoted to. I think we go from good to great.
Grant?
I totally agree. There have been some very promising developments over even the past week. So I think we need to focus on adult stem cells right now.
And you get the last word.
Krauthammer said the debate between embryonic and adult stem cells is really over, and I agree. I think morally the debate is over.
All right. Thank you very much, Grant, Elizabeth, and of course, Monsignor, for being with us. And thank you all for watching us. Remember that you don't need a TV to watch the net. We are always online at netny.net. For all of us here, I'm Jane Hansen. See you next time in the arena.